30 seconds, please. Joe, tell me when we're live and recording, okay? Okay, we are now live and recording. Thank you. So, because it will be recorded, please be careful what you say. It will go up online, and I'm sure you will. Let's all take a deep breath, because I sure need one. Let's do that again. We have the wind at our backs with the IPCC and the Nobel Prize this week. And the Calgary Herald editorial said the premiers who don't believe in carbon pricing basically are like emperors with no clothes. So I'm going to do this really quickly. Okay. In your own way, please acknowledge that we are here today on Algonquin territory. Please, in your own mind, just do that right now. Sorry to interrupt your thoughts. And I do things really quickly. But I'm going to switch to what we need to do now. Okay. We have children here today, and they want to teach us how to play with the parachutes. So Sophia, Maggie, Selma, Claire. We also have a baby here today, first time ever at a conference, to remind us why we're here. We need about 3 or 4 more people to come help the children, because that parachute's big. So for those of you who will be on Parliament Hill on Monday, we encourage you to play with these parachutes. Okay, so that's it. Let's get that ball going. Woo! Okay. All right. Okay, we can stop that now. I see you're having fun. This is the whole point. Be like children. Okay, so no, we've got a few more things we have to learn how to do. Do you think you can walk in a circle with that parachute together? No, there's 3 or 4 more things. I've been learning how to play with a parachute this summer. So just walk in do a little ripply thing and walk in a circle. Okay, wonderful. This is bringing such great energy to the room. Thank you. Okay, now we need to do a couple things without that ball on there. So hand the ball over to someone. Okay, so I want Maggie and Selma to do this. They're going to make the parachute go up and down 5 times. And on the 5th time, you two are going to change spots, okay? You're going to run under. And don't smash into each other, all right? 1, 2, 3, 4. This one, run. 5, run. Yoo-hoo! There we go. All right. Okay. Do it a couple more times. Claire, why don't you do it with Joanne? You ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. Next time, run. Excellent. And the last one to do is you all just slow it down a bit. Make it go up and down, like nice and slow. And on the 5th one, if you can, and if you can't, I'm sorry, get down as fast as you can and get underneath that parachute, okay? That's why you're down there. I can't do this one. Okay, 1. There. Yes. Thank you. That's it. That's all. If you, in a few moments, we can, yeah, we can leave it out. It's decorating the room nicely. Thank you, everyone. Big round of applause for those who got out of their comfort zones. This is our 5th national conference and our 13th time on Parliament Hill as a collective. And every single conference has been facilitated by my dear friend Jerry LaBelle, whom just is like my rock I hold on to as we ride this tsunami that we've been riding for the past decade, when people said, carbon pricing, no way. Look at where we are. Okay, I'm going to introduce Jerry. Jerry should feel very much at home. He's also, he's from the Algonquin people. His mother is, and he lives on a beautiful lake in northern Ontario. And he's a year older. Okay.
That was last year. He's 1 year older. Right on. Thank you. What was this? Yeah, I know, but my mind's making appointments my body can't keep these days. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. First of all, take a photo of your lobbying schedule if you haven't done so already, so please do that. Number 2, put a name and phone number on everything that you get here so we know who it belongs to. Number 3, the bathroom is right outside the door. I should have started with that maybe. Number 4, there's a parachute in the corner to sign for Monday. So we'd appreciate if you would sign that parachute. Showing that this conference has landed in Ottawa. Is that fair? Okay, good. Okay. And the Wi-Fi access number is 250CS for this conference. 250CS. It's on the walls here and there, but just reminding you. One of the things I keep saying to people is that as Canadians, we don't celebrate enough. That's one of our biggest issues in this country. So we need to celebrate a little bit. So I want people to, everybody get up, everybody stand up, because you're going to be sitting for quite a while. And just want to acknowledge everyone who's here. So when I say something, I want everybody to say thank you as loud as you can. I want to also acknowledge the people who are listening at home. If you're alone at home, get up and say thank you as well. So this is what we're going to do. Okay? When I say something, you're all going to say thank you. Okay? Actually, let's just say thank you for caring. I think that's even better. So the first one, if you're here for the first time together, thank you for caring. If this is not your first conference, if you got a letter published, or if you wrote a letter to the editor this year, if you got your letter published and or recorded and letter to the editor, if you talk to friends and enemies and strangers about climate change, and thank you very, very much for caring enough to be at this conference. Thank you. Give yourself a hand. When I do workshops, I actually teach people how to celebrate because we don't celebrate very well. We're so bad at patting ourselves on the back. We really are. So thank you very much for coming. This is my 5th conference, 6th. I don't know what you said. It's the 5th conference? 5th conference, okay. I don't know. It's 6, 7, 8, 9. It's been a long time. And we are winning. That's the important part. Isn't that amazing? We are winning. I know it doesn't seem like it in Ontario, but we'll get there. Don't worry. So I'm not going to say anything more about politics for the next few minutes. So we're moving on here. So first on our agenda is I want to introduce our first keynote speaker. Dr. David Maenz received his Ph.D. from the University of Saskatchewan and held several academic positions prior to co-founding MCN BioProducts in 2001. Dr. Maenz is the inventor or co-inventor of 7 patents and is the author of 33 scientific papers and 2 book chapters. Dr. Maenz has retired from business interests and lives in Saskatoon. He's the author of The Price of Carbon. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to welcome Dr. David Maenz to the podium.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Kathy, and CCL Canada for inviting me to kick off this conference, which I'm quite confident is going to be several days of good information and obviously a lot of entertainment going along with the whole thing. Okay, so over the last 30 years or so, experts working at universities and research institutes around the world have developed a real deep understanding of the science and economics of climate change, where we can now accurately predict what will happen in the situation of severe climate damage with unmitigated climate change. We can also determine the pathways that are required to effectively mitigate climate change. So what I'd like to do over the course of this talk is to summarize the current status of knowledge and hopefully provide some information that's going to be of use to everyone and CCL in general in promoting knowledge on climate change and what constitutes effective and cost-efficient climate action programs. Okay. There we go. So briefly, I'll just go through anthropogenic or man-made climate change. And this graph is taken from NASA's website on climate change. And basically what we see here is the temperatures recorded over the last 140 years. They use mid-period in the last century as a base. Temperatures have gone up by about 0.9 degrees Celsius. This is simply the reality of global warming. Anyone who denies this is basically denying the validity of measurements made by meteorologists around the world. And this is equivalent to believing in a flat Earth, to be quite frankly. A more subtle type of climate denial is, and you'll hear this all the time, especially from certain elected officials, that yes, I can accept that the planet is changing, but I have problems accepting that this is entirely caused by human activity. Let's see. So this is atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations over the last 4,000 years. This is accurately measured in ice core samples and more recently with direct sampling from air. Atmospheric CO2 is steady over the past 4,000 years up until the point of industrialization. The quantity of greenhouse gases that has accumulated in the environment from the onset of industrialization matches what is measured in the atmosphere. Further, there is no natural source of such a massive accumulation of greenhouse gases. Finally, there are no natural anomalies that could account for a 1 degree increase in surface temperatures. So quite frankly, since the onset of industrialization, the activities of man have led to an accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere sufficient to cause about a 1 degree Celsius increase in surface temperatures. Okay, so what's this going to cause? And this parachute here is kind of neat because it's got more detail than I've got on the slide here. Sea level rise. Sea level rise in combination with increased severity and frequency of cyclones is going to have devastating impacts on coastal areas and specifically on densely populated cities located in North America and Asia. Ocean acidification, this is going to have devastating effects on sensitive ecosystems, particularly coral reefs around the world. Inland, climate damage is going to be characterized by shifting weather patterns. We're seeing a lot of this already, and in combination with a higher frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Secondary effects of climate change damage include crop failures, famine, climate migration, human conflict, economic stagnation, and loss of life and livelihood. Oops. Now, the extent of this damage will vary directly with the magnitude of surface warming. The more that the Earth warms, the greater the severity of climate damage. And this is not going to be a uniform effect. Certain regions on Earth are more vulnerable to climate damage, specifically small islands, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia. These are the most climate vulnerable regions on Earth. Okay, even though the magnitude of damage will vary dependent on location and circumstance of a given country, The greenhouse gases that are causing surface warming and this damage are well mixed and dispersed in the atmosphere. So what this means is that a metric ton of carbon dioxide that was emitted in, let's say, 2018 from a coal burning power plant in Saskatchewan will persist in the atmosphere and will result in extreme hardship and suffering in Nigeria while having much less of an effect in Western Canada. Okay, so this is a business unusual scenario, and this would happen if we did nothing, if there's zero mitigation policies enacted on Earth at all. What would happen is that atmospheric CO2 would go up to about 1,000 ppm by the end of the century. This would cause 5 to 6 degrees of global warming and catastrophic climate damage. There would be many regions on Earth that would simply be uninhabitable. This scenario is unlikely to occur unless there's a complete rollback of policies that have been enacted thus far. So with that then, what I'd like to do is talk about the current state of global policies, specifically under the Paris Agreement, and the cost of inaction or action in advancing these policies. So the Paris Climate Agreement, as everyone is probably aware in this room, in 2015, the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change got together and they came to an agreement that future surface temperatures should be held to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. Under the provisions of the Paris Climate Agreement, each country is to devise, or a group of countries, their own targets or pledges to reduce future emissions. And what most countries did is they have submitted pledges to reduce or control emissions in the year 2030 relative to a baseline level. And in Canada, our pledge is to achieve a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030 relative to emissions that are on record for 2005. Okay, so what does this mean? This is a graph of projections of future emissions with time, going to the end of the century here. And what we see here is the green line. This is current global policies. If we don't change what's currently in place for policies, emissions will peak sometime after the year 2030, and we will commit the planet to about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of surface warming over the course of the century. The pledges contained in the Paris Agreement will lower this rate of emissions, but we will still result in severe climate change damage. The red line shows an emissions trajectory that is in line with limiting surface warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And the way this would work is emissions would peak very soon, around the year 2020, and then decline in a linear fashion, arriving at net zero atmospheric accumulation about 2070. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has determined the remaining budget of emissions is about 700 billion tons of carbon dioxide that can be released to the environment safely and limit surface warming to 2 degrees Celsius. This blue line shows an emissions trajectory that matches 1.5 degrees of future surface warming. The budget of this, maintaining the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's already expanded. Technically, it is conceivable that in the second half of the century, we could see practices transition to net carbon dioxide withdrawal. And if there's enough CDR, carbon dioxide reduction, this could compensate for excess emissions in the earlier part of the century and allow us to maintain surface warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is not going to be easy. And from the IPCC report that just came out last week, it may not even be possible. But technically, there is a chance, there is some degree of feasibility here.
Dr. Maenz?
Yes?
You said, I just want to clarify, you said there's already enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to get to 1.5, is that?
So already enough to get to 1.5 implies that we're already basically at 1.5. We're at about 1 degree Celsius, but we can't really release much more at all. There's very little budget left. So okay, the social cost of carbon. This is a value that is placed on the damage potential of emitting 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide, expressed at present day values. And this is the latest data that comes from Dr. Nordhaus's group out of Yale University. And so this is applied this is determined, I should say, based on an extrapolation of current policies. And Dr. Nordhaus just received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his brilliant work on developing the social cost of carbon. And in 2050, this is estimated at $31 a ton, and it'll go up to about $100 a ton by mid-century or so. So based on current rates of emission, this equates to 2% of global GDP. Damage caused by climate change is only one component of the actual cost of combusting fossil fuels. The World Bank estimates that there are 7 million early deaths per year as a result of air pollution. This is staggering. This is a Holocaust a year happening from air pollution. And 3.7 million of these deaths are what they classify as outdoor air pollution. A lot of this has to do with combustion of coal and also transportation in densely populated cities and the smog that results there. The remaining deaths, 3.3 million early deaths per year, come from combustion of coal and biomass for cooking and heating purposes in developing countries. So, fossil fuels are generally priced by the cost of extraction and processing, and they ignore the cost associated with future climate change or the cost associated with local air pollution from the area where the combustion happens. And this is a study just very recently put together by the International Monetary Fund, and they pegged the cost of local air pollution at $2.6 trillion in 2015, equivalent to over 3% of global GDP. So when you add the cost of local air pollution with the cost of future global warming and other pre-tax subsidies, there's still a fair amount of subsidies that are applied to promote fossil fuel resource extraction and exploration, along with other factors that are not accounted for, you get $5.3 trillion of global subsidies that we're not paying for when we pay for fossil fuels. This equates to 6.5% of global GDP. And this is coming again from the International Monetary Fund. So let's take a quick look at the breakdown of these fossil fuel subsidies. 56% of it's applied to coal. And within coal, 75% is accounted for by the cost of damage and the healthcare damage of combustion of coal. The other 25% comes from future damage from climate change. Petroleum products are also heavily subsidized by a mixture of pre-tax subsidies, climate change damage, and unpaid for local air pollution. For natural gas, most of the subsidy applies to future climate change damage. So the take home from this is fossil fuels are very expensive and they're currently grossly underpriced by ignoring these externalities. Okay, so this is a study that just came out at Stanford University, and it's a brilliant study on the cost of climate change damage, and it includes now the full spectrum of primary damage and secondary effects. So what we see here is the cost of damage, 1.5 degrees Celsius surface warming, 2 degrees, and damage if emissions were to follow the current set of pledges submitted by countries in the, under the IPCC. And we also see the cost of damage if we follow current global policies that would arrive at 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in future warming. And this is all expressed as a change in global GDP in the latter part of the century. So if we were to maintain surface temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would save $10 trillion in comparison to allowing surface temperatures to increase to 2 degrees Celsius. How big is this number? 12.5% of GDP in 2015. Under current policies, where we're heading right now, with 3 to 4 degrees of Celsius in future surface warming, this is going to cost future generations somewhere between 25% and 35% of global GDP. The estimates for the cost of taking actions are somewhere in the range of 1 to 2% of global GDP. Most of this cost is incurred as we get closer to mid-century. So you just look at these numbers and it's very clear there is a massive rate of return on investment and for taking effective action on climate change rather than impose this tremendous cost on future generations. Okay, each year the United Nations Environment Program puts out what they call the Emissions Gap Report. And this is an assessment of current policies and projected emissions to the year 2030 in comparisons to the rates of emissions that are aligned with the Paris Agreement objectives of limiting surface warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius. They also include in their emissions gap report an assessment of abatement opportunities by economic sector. And if there's, there are some good news stories here. One of the more exciting areas is the pace of technical advance of developing low carbon technologies and practices. Right now, we have a tremendous opportunity to reduce emissions over the next 11 years from the energy sector, specifically for the production of electricity. This could be accomplished by increasing energy efficiencies across economic sectors to reduce demand, phasing out coal power plants, and switching over to zero and low emissions options for the production of electricity. Industry has, again, a real opportunity to cut emissions by electrification of certain practices and also by switching fuels to zero and low emissions options. Some of the most cost-effective opportunities to abate emissions are in the forestry sector through programs of improved land use management and halting deforestation and ideally transitioning to replanting forests, which would act as a carbon sink. Finally, in the last 5 years, we've seen tremendous advances in electric vehicles. To charge an electric vehicle costs 20% of the cost of putting a gasoline fuel in a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle. There's really no technical reasons for a massive fleet changeover over the next 11 years toward electric vehicles, including heavy-duty trucks. There are also opportunities in agriculture and building sector. If all of these abatement opportunities were to be achieved, the reduction of emission potential is actually well in excess of the current gap between policies and what needs to be accomplished to limit future warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, with that background, I'm going to now discuss Canada and Canada's current policies on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and our contribution to the global effort. Okay, currently, this is the latest data from 2016, emissions from Canada, about 700 million tons of CO2 per year, equaling 1.6% of the global total. So you'll hear people say 1.6%. Who cares? Whatever we accomplish or not, or do not accomplish is not going to have an impact on future global warming. Well, the fact is 35% of global emissions come from Canada and countries with similar or lower rates of global emissions. If each one of these countries were to take an attitude that our contribution doesn't count, we're going to impose severe climate damage on future generations. In addition, as an advanced economy, we have an obligation to take a leadership role and to acknowledge the reality of climate change and implement effective climate action policies. So arguments that we don't release very much, so who cares, they don't fly. 35% of, that's Canada, plus all of the countries with emissions similar or less than. Okay, so if you look at greenhouse gas emissions by sector, we have a lot of emissions coming from the oil and gas sector. This is because we're a fairly traditional resource-based economy. Our emissions from the transportation sector and the building sector are typical of an advanced economy. Emissions from electricity on a percentage basis are about half of what you see for an advanced economy. And the reason why we have much less emissions from electricity is extensive use of zero emissions hydropower in many regions of the country, the shutdown of the coal-fired power plants in Ontario, and continuation of use of nuclear power in Ontario. The rest of the emissions come from heavy industry, agriculture, and waste. Provincially, 15% of Canadians live in Alberta plus Saskatchewan. However, these two oil and gas rich provinces account for nearly half of national emissions. And this is because of the concentration of oil and gas sector activities in these provinces. I should also mention that within the oil and gas sector, a huge component of the emissions come from methane that is released in the field, or what's called upstream sources of methane. The intensity of emissions of these two provinces is such that on a per person basis, over 4 times the amount of CO2 is released than the rest of the country. So this is quite important. Canada has an extensive fossil fuel-based economy, and there's a lot of emissions coming from this sector. Yes?
Sorry, I have a question in terms of is that those emissions the best
They're,
or is export?
yeah, they're all domestic. They're all domestic. So there's no accounting for exported emissions. And then, for instance, the United States using oil and gas that we've sent there. That goes under their inventory. Yeah.
If I may for a second, we'll hold a question till the end because we'll use the microphone. Otherwise, we can't hear you over the internet. Okay.
Okay.
So thank you.
Okay. Okay. Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change. What this is a set of minimal standards of carbon pricing and policies that must be implemented within provincial climate action plans, or this will be imposed from the federal government. The core, the foundation of the PCF is a minimal price of carbon starting at $10 a ton that must be in place this year and advances at $10 a ton incrementally to the year 2022, which would be $50 per ton. A couple of other important policies: phase out of coal-fired power plants by 2030, and reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by 45% by 2025. This was 2022. They pushed this back to 2025. So what the PCF is intended, it's based on the concept of provincial cooperation, and that each province would be able to design its own, the specifics of its own climate action plan, but these specifics must meet certain standards. And if you compare the climate policies and greenhouse gas emissions from British Columbia to Saskatchewan, we will see the need for the PCF as a stopgap measure to ensure provincial compliance. And we'll do that right now. Okay. In 2008, province of British Columbia introduced a carbon tax. This currently covers 70% of emissions from the province, and it's set at $35 per metric ton of CO2. The tax is set to increase at $5 increments, and clearly this BC's provincial carbon tax is compliant with the federal PCF. In comparison, Saskatchewan has had no carbon pricing and, to be truthful, has not implemented any significant climate action plans whatsoever over this time frame. So you've got an opportunity here to compare data from a province that put in carbon pricing 10 years ago now with a province that did nothing. So if you look at BC, there's been a 17% drop in fossil fuel sales. And this is not a result of people running across the border and buying cheap gas. This is actual internal sales have dropped and use of fossil fuel products. This has resulted in about a 5% reduction in emissions in BC in this period after the carbon pricing compared to prior to the carbon pricing. In comparison to Saskatchewan, there's been a 30% increase in sales of gasoline comparing this period 2007 to 2016. And we have seen in Saskatchewan a 7.5% increase in absolute rates of greenhouse gas emissions. So the next question that's always put to me, yeah, but is that because of differences in economic performance? It's not. GDP growth for BC and Saskatchewan were almost identical post carbon pricing and pre and post carbon pricing. So this is not a result of a difference in economic performance. If you look at the rate of emissions coming from Saskatchewan, and yes, this is largely driven by the intensity of the oil and gas industry in the province, 67 tons of carbon dioxide are emitted per person. This is 5-fold greater than the rate in British Columbia. So clearly, this, in my mind, is some of the strongest evidence we have of the potency and effectiveness of carbon pricing, and it also agrees with the consensus of opinion from economists that the costs over the short term are minimal. We haven't seen an impact on BC's economy of implementing a successful carbon price. Okay, Saskatchewan has announced the major components of a provincial carbon plan. They call it Prairie Resilience. This plan does not include any provision for carbon pricing, and it is not compliant with the Pan-Canadian framework. There are no emissions reductions targets in this plan. It's just there. The actions, and there are some significant components here, are focused on increased electrical grid penetrations from renewables and a reduction in methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. And this is data taken from the province's own publications. We will see a reduction in emissions relative to the business as usual scenario. However, projected emissions in the year 2030 are basically the same as what's on record for Saskatchewan in 2015. An effective climate action plan for the province of Saskatchewan would see a drop in emissions by about 30% relative to 2005. This would put Saskatchewan in line with its provincial obligation to contribute to the national effort under the Paris Agreement. So what we have here is basically a token gesture, if you will, of a climate action plan that really will accomplish little to reduce this extreme intensity of emissions from the province. Okay, the Pembina Institute has put together a simulator. It's a beautiful bit of work here, and it allows anyone can go online and input and output various climate change policies. And this is a policy, or I should say this is a model based on implementing the Pan-Canadian framework and then extending carbon pricing beyond 2022, adding $10 a year on an annual basis. If you do that, we will meet our Paris targets. And if you take away carbon pricing, you basically cut the heart out of the whole system. There's no way you approach anywhere near achieving our Paris targets. If one were to, and I've done this, increase the price of carbon at any one of these points here, this red line comes down. You increase the potency of the entire plan to reduce future emissions. This is a study from Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. And this is based on assessing scenarios of carbon pricing, starting at $30 a ton, and then increasing by $10 a year to the year 2027. They then determined the impact of the carbon pricing on GDP relative to no policies. Okay. The revenue coming from the carbon fee in this particular study is then recycled back into the Canadian economy. And this is either done by transfers to households, transfers to industry, or cuts in taxes, or investment in clean energy technology. The take home from this study is the costs of implementing a carbon price are very low. In fact, the costs are within the measurement of error of the study. And this again agrees with the majority of opinion from climate economists that over the short-term mitigation period, the cost of effective climate actions are very small. We start to see the cost as you get closer to mid-century and you have to implement some of the more challenging and costly measures. Okay. Eco-Fiscal Commission extended this study, and they tried to develop the cost of a framework of policies that did not include carbon pricing. And if you can even pull this off, you end up with a very complex set of regulations. And it's very costly because you're not accessing the efficiencies of the marketplace. You're just trying to pick and choose specific policies and say, you know, auto emissions have to be this, emissions from lighting in your home have to be this, et cetera, et cetera. And it becomes, again, extremely costly, very difficult to manage, and I would say probably impossible to pull off. And why would you do it when you can do this in a cost-effective manner with carbon pricing? The cost advantage of carbon pricing in this eco-fiscal study are enormous. They estimate that in the absence of carbon pricing, a complex set of regulatory frameworks would result in a GDP that was 3.8% less than if you accomplished the same thing using carbon pricing. Okay, I know this graph looks a little complex, but it's really worthwhile doing. This is coming from Climate Action Tracker. Climate Action Tracker is a consortium of 4 of the world's top institutes that look at climate economics. And what Climate Action Tracker does is they assess the climate action plans of all of the top emitting countries and then come up with a rating system. So what we have here is emissions going forward up to mid-century, and this dark green bar would be Canada's emission rates that would be aligned with a global effort resulting in well below 1.5 degrees Celsius of future surface warming. The light green would be a 1.5, less than 1.5 C world. The yellow between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The orange between 2 and 3. The red between 3 and 4. And the brown would be Canada's contribution along with the rest of the world in contributing to emissions resulting in over 4 degrees of future surface warming. So what we have here, the dark line, these are historical emissions. This wedge is based on the range of emissions following current policies. So as it stands right now, we would be contributing to a world between 3 and 4 degrees of future surface warming. If we were to implement the PCF, emissions come down and we would be contributing to a world between 2 and 3 degrees of future surface warming. This is our Paris target, and this can be achieved simply by extending carbon pricing beyond 2022, going up incrementally to over $100 a ton by the time we get to 2030. Okay, so this is Climate Action Tracker's global ratings by country. We currently stand, and our rating is highly insufficient because we're in this group of countries that if all countries were to have a similar level of ambition, would contribute to between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius of global warming. If we can successfully implement the Pan-Canadian framework and get carbon pricing in effect right across the country, we would move to the insufficient category. However, what's important here is you could say, yeah, but we're still not pulling our weight. Getting the Pan-Canadian framework in place puts that mechanism in place. If we then see a global effort to increase the ambition to combat climate change, Canada would have that economic driver in place to be part of this. All we would have to do is increase the carbon price that applied on an annual basis. That we'd have the mechanism in place, and we would be a global leader in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Okay, summary and take-home messages from this talk. I know there's a lot of data here. I did this deliberately because I find in some talks that there's a tendency not to get into details, and I kind of look at it the opposite. The details are vitally important for people to understand the magnitude of the issues and the way out of it. First, anthropogenic climate change is real. A failure of our generation to cut emissions and establish pathways of progressive decarbonization of practice will have devastating and costly impacts on future generations. We owe this to the next generations to act. The cost of current practices beyond future climate change damage, or beyond future climate change damage. Sorry to yell in the microphone there. And they include damaging effects from local air pollution, and this should not be forgotten when we're talking about combustion of fossil fuels. Globally, a scenario based on current policies will result in 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in surface warming, and this is going to cost future generations somewhere between 25 and 35% of global GDP. All countries, including Canada, must up the level of ambition to combat climate change. The return on investment for avoiding future damage is immense, and clearly justifies adoption of policies to designed to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. In Canada, implementation of the Pan-Canadian framework, either through provincial cooperation and the provinces designing their own system, or if they don't want to, having it imposed upon them, is absolutely required if we are to meet our international obligations under the Paris Agreement. The costs of well-designed climate action plans based on a foundation of carbon pricing are minimal over the short-term period. Higher costs come into effect as we move toward deep decarbonization around mid-century and beyond. Carbon pricing is the foundation of effective, cost-effective climate plans. In the absence of carbon pricing, a pure regulatory approach will be far less effective and will be costly to implement. And finally, an opposition to carbon pricing is an opposition to the most cost-effective and efficient pathways of emission reduction. And I feel this last emboldened statement here summarizes everything. Through inaction, an opposition to carbon pricing is a form of climate change denial. Okay. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Just before we open the floor to questions, just let everybody know my book is for sale over here. And if you look around you, you will see no middlemen involved in the usual series of transactions between the author and someone buying a book. So it's actually cheaper than you can buy it online or in the bookstore. So yes, if anyone would like a copy, I'll even sign it for them. Sure. Okay.
We're going to grab this one, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. So if you have questions, raise your hands and I will come to you. Okay, we'll start at this end. Hey, Tom, how are you?
In the recent report by the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, she also did a survey about Ontario. And one of the points she made was in the industrial sector, there are fewer opportunities for emissions reductions, whereas they're sort of obvious and already out there for things like electricity and transportation. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, that's this guy going? Yep. Okay, that's entirely true. The IPPC, and when they do their assessment by categories, industry is going to lag in its pathway of reductions because there's certain industrial practices that will be very costly to decarbonize. Some of the best examples are manufacture of cement. Manufacture of cement accounts for 4% of global emissions. And when you make cement, it's a chemical reaction that releases CO2. So you can't not burn fossil fuels, for example, to fuel that process. You get this chemical release. So the only way to deal with that is through carbon capture and storage. And that's not going to come into place until mid-century or so, when you start to go to these more demanding abatements. So that's entirely correct, that industry is going to lag behind. What has happened remarkably in the last 5 years is that the opportunities in transportation have really stepped forward. And technically, there's no reason for transition to electric vehicles and just changing the fleet over the next 20 years.
Hi, Joanne Light from Halifax. Thank you. What are your thoughts on the constitutional and legal process for the federal government to impose the PCL carbon pricing plan on the uncooperative rogue provinces, and whether our current government has the ability legally and willfully to follow through?
Wow. Okay, that is perhaps the core question about what the next election is going to be about. And from my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, the provinces that are bringing forth a legal challenge to the PCF are not going to win. And the reason, the reason is that we have an international obligation under the Paris Agreement to achieve these emissions reductions. And if, for instance, Saskatchewan doesn't want to play ball, and Saskatchewan's responsible for 11% of emissions, we can't accomplish that without something coming from above. So that's my understanding of the legality here. As to, wow, the next question, which is political in nature, that I think we're going to find out who we are as a people in this country in the next federal election. All indications are it's going to be a one-issue election, and I'm really hopeful that Canadians will show their true colors and begin to understand this issue. It's not overly complex. The economics are straightforward, and it makes so much sense to put a carbon price in place. So hopefully we get effective communication to the population of the country, and they vote accordingly.
Thank you very much. Cheryl McNamara from Toronto. I just have a couple of questions. First, is your presentation available to us?
Oh yeah,
Okay,
I'll do that. Kathy will make it happen somehow.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Good, thank you. The other question I have is relating to the one I posed earlier with regards to Canada's emissions in the oil sands. Mm-hmm. And exported. Do we know the emissions count for the exported fossil fuels? And then the other question I have is, oh, do I only get one? Is that the rule? Citizens Climate Lobby, we advocate for a rising price in carbon as upstream as possible. I'm wondering if there's any analysis on the effectiveness of how, if it's at the wellhead compared to the retail.
Yeah, so just turning to the oil sands are an relatively emissions intensive process. It's about 20% more CO2 released per unit of fossil fuel production coming from the oil sands. You still get most of the release at the point of combustion, but because of the process involved in getting that oil from the bitumen, it's energy intensive and it does use more CO2. As to and I haven't done these calculations, so I really don't know how much emissions are coming from exported products from Canada. I would say quite a lot. But in working through all of this, this is a demand side issue, not a supply side issue. If we, for instance, implement a carbon price and you supplement that with other policies to promote purchase of electric vehicles, as an example, that demand starts to go down. And this is what's going to lead to global emissions reductions. If, for instance, Canada were tomorrow somehow magically to go to a cap and turn off the flow of oil from this country, it's just going to come from another source while the demand's there. The focus has got to be on the demand side of the equation. And if you go to the Pembina Institute's policy simulator, it's all demand side. And that's where the efforts have to be. And that's why the work of organizations such as CCL is so encouraging, because it is on the real problem, which is demand for energy intensive products and services. And what was the second question? Oh, yeah, oil and gas sector, it's one of the low-hanging fruits. And prior to the election of Mr. Trump in the States, we did have an agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico to be coordinated in reducing methane emissions by 45%. Mr. Trump has since that time said, forget that. So the problem with that is you get an unlevel playing field. And then you've got companies in Canada that then are reluctant to go along with it because they feel that they're going to be at a competitive disadvantage with producers in North Dakota, as an example. And it was a beautiful piece of environmental legislation when it came out, that agreement between the three countries. But unfortunately, we're kind of on our own here. My own take on it is that industry can tolerate a 45% reduction in methane emissions, regardless if there's cooperation south of the border.
Mike, thank you. This is before last question, be this gentleman, and then the gentleman over there.
Hi, David. My name is Bruce. I'm from Thunder Bay. Brilliant presentation. Thank you for it. I'm building on Joanne's question. I was really disappointed in the abdication of leadership at the federal level to pass the buck to the provinces. So it seems to me it's not only a lack of leadership, but isn't it inefficient and complicated and more expensive to go this roundabout route rather than simply have a national carbon fee and a national dividend program?
Yeah, what happens, or what did happen, is specifically Saskatchewan and Alberta said that we've got a higher percentage of what are termed emissions intensive trade exposed companies. And yes, you're probably right, like deal with it. And so Saskatchewan continues to argue that we have to design our own climate action plan because our economy is so different, and that we have this emissions intensive trade exposed companies. So the federal government said, go ahead, come up with your own plan, but it's got to mean something. It's got to actually achieve. We may be headed toward a national system just because of the failure of Ontario, or Ontario's cancellation of the cap and trade system, and Manitoba has said that they're no longer in agreement, and obviously Saskatchewan has been an outlier all along. But it would be great if we did have a national program. And I think within that national program, you could have provisions to deal with those emissions intensive trade exposed companies. There are economic mechanisms that reduce the impact on those companies. And Alberta has got a very nice set of policies to deal with that issue. So yeah, I think it would be better and clearer if we had a national program. But I can see politically how it happened the way it did.
Thank you.
Rolly from Ottawa. I understand fully what you mean when you say that the PCF, with its aggressive carbon pricing and policy framework, can get us to 2050. But I'm wondering how that can be done when our government is so focused not on demand, but on supply. There's a white elephant in the room, and it's called the tar sands, and it's called LNG, and it's called drilling off Nova Scotia. So that's where I cannot fit the two pieces together.
Here's my take on Canada's position. For the next 15, 20 years, us having higher per capita or per person rates of emission is probably going to happen while demand for oil and gas products continues. But what's going to kill the supply side is the demand side. It's just going to take some time. So, I think the focus has got to continue to be on the demand side. And the other thing that this does is it positions Canada for success in a decarbonized economy by working on the demand side. Electricity produced by clean energy sources is one thing. Industry decarbonizing. All these things can happen without turning the tap off on oil and gas. And again, if we just go out there and say, we're turning the tap off, that supply, that demand is going to be met by Saudi Arabia and the United States of America. So yeah, my own take is continue to focus on the demand side. At the same time, the oil sands and Saskatchewan's oil and gas sector have to do a lot better in reducing methane emissions and clean up their act. And that can happen by policies. And so, yeah, it's kind of a balance in there. But demand side is what's going to kill the industry.
I have read, and I'm touching on what Tom asked it earlier on, that we have pretty much expended our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So if that is true, like, I don't get all these pathways that are supposedly going to lead us to a rise of only 1.5 degrees. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. Are we just kidding ourselves, or are we banking on at some point in the unforeseen future there's going to be a lot of removal from the atmosphere?
That's
or what?
That carbon dioxide removal, that's the only way to get to 1.5 now. And that would involve a combination of extensive replanting of forest, afforestation, and reforestation. And there's a lot of potential carbon dioxide withdrawal that can happen with global management of forestries. But that's probably not enough anymore. This would be supplemented by industrial carbon dioxide removal and storage in deep saline aquifers. Whether that's actually going to happen or not, the latest IPCC report had something like 50 scenarios, and only 2 of them arrive at 1.5 because we've unfortunately have done very little since 1979 to address this issue globally. So you're right, it hardly adds up anymore. It's really tough, 1.5.
So then why then are they kidding the world, really, with the idea that it could be done?
Okay, here's Francois Mitterrand in Paris 2015 made a tremendous statement, and he said, it is better to put out a target and a level of ambition that we can't achieve rather than to put out a weak level of ambition that has failure built into it. Yeah, I think unfortunately it's come down to that. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you, Dr. Maenz, for that really excellent presentation. I think all of us learned a lot, and it's definitely going to help us when we meet with our elected representatives on Monday and Tuesday. So on behalf of everyone at Citizens Climate Lobby, I'm going to try and balance this and not break it. Thank you. I know these very elegant boxes display, but thank you. Thank you. A round of applause.
So we're going to climate action training with Judy O'Leary. This is for new CCLers in Dorchester room, 4th floor.